Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled, What Net Zero Modeling of Electricity and Gas Tells Us About Energy Policy. We're grateful to our speakers, Chyong and Michael Pollitt, for today's timely discussion. And note that this paper was recently published in our journal entitled The Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy. But first, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please use Zoom's Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom window to type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator and first speaker, Chyong, who is a research associate at the Cambridge Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Chyong, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Let me just share my screen, and I think hopefully everyone can see the full screen of the slides. Yes, thank you very much, and welcome to this webinar. We are very pleased to present one of the major research projects that we have conducted in 2019, 2020, and 2021. It's 1.5 year research project, which has been sponsored by the Center on Regulation in Europe, which is a large think tank focusing on energy economics and regulation, which is based in Brussels. We very grateful to the sponsors of this research project, and in particular, we also are very grateful to our co-authors from the Cambridge University Energy Policy Research Group, Dr. David Reiner, Dr. Carmen Lee, and other research assistants who have participated in this project. So this is really to give you a flavor of the key findings, and those key findings and policy recommendations have been published, as Dave mentioned, in an upcoming issue of the Energy Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy. For those of you who would like to have a more detailed analysis, there's a full report of 171 pages in total with all the numbers and details around the modeling results. That has been published back in March 2021 by Sarah. That's the full report. So for today, we'd like to give you a summary of the objective of the research project, the key methodological questions, and then we'll focus on main results and offer some of the conclusions from the modeling. And then I'll hand over to Michael Pollitt to discuss the policy recommendations that is coming out from the based on the modeling results. So research questions. We were primarily interested in 2 themes, and those are this. What are the sources of flexibility of gas and electricity in a deep decarbonization? And what are the complementarity dimensions and trends of different energy sources and vectors in a deeply decarbonized energy system? And we focus on a European energy system, and in particular EU 27 member states, UK, Norway, and Switzerland. The objective of the study was really to calibrate and remodel some of the long-term energy scenarios that the European Commission has published back in 2018. European Commission published 8 long-term scenarios focusing on various level of decarbonization by 2050, ranging from 65% to net zero. So we focus on net zero scenarios in Europe. We also model 3 other scenarios as well. One that leads us to 90% of greenhouse gas reduction relative to 1990 level, and the other 2 sensitivity scenarios around the net zero. And we're going to be discussing those in details in the coming slides. And the other objective of the study really was to use the modeling results to think about the potential policy and regulatory implication that would get us to net zero. So the central focus of our study was on sector coupling. What sector coupling is about? It is, or in other words, energy system integration. It is commonly understood as integrating the energy consuming sectors such as building, transport, and industry, and optimize them with the energy supply sector. So this is really about the holistic view of trying to plan long-term energy system capacity expansion to take into account the characteristics of the demand side, and in particular, the hourly fluctuation of wind and solar, for example, as well as hourly demand for energy services such as space heating in buildings, usage of road transport, as well as industry energy consumption at hourly granularity. So that is what we try to capture in our energy system modeling. It is it is based philosophically on the Times energy system modeling, but with some improvements in terms of capturing hourly granularity, which is very important to understand the implication of net zero on energy investment, and in particular, investment in energy infrastructure, such as networks. So the core research focuses on coupling between electricity and the gas supply system, taking into account explicitly their interactions with the energy consuming sectors and key end-use technologies. What we focus on in terms of the sector coupling technologies, we integrate 2 main technologies that are power to gas and power to liquids at the system, so that at the transmission level. And down to the distribution and household level, we also focus on hybrid heat pumps as a potential technologies that could offer system flexibility when both gas and electricity are tightly coupled. And we also consider flexibility in terms of the networks. For example, connecting various consumption and production for renewables to exploit negative covariances of variable renewable production. We focus on the role of system integration technologies that we just mentioned, power to X, hybrid heat pumps, and obviously we also focus on the role of storage, be it interseasonal storage to modulate the summer-winter demand differences to the intraday flexibility that is needed to move energy from 1 hour to another hour. In terms of the main policy variables and constraints that we model in our study, we use the cost estimates for most of the technologies, and we base this on the European Commission's long-term scenario modeling, taking into account most of the costs that we would need. As we mentioned before, we model hourly granularity to take into account the flexibility requirement that might be needed in a net zero scenario. In terms of the CO2 emissions constraints, we implemented a net zero constraint at the EU 27 level, but also in some of the key countries such as Sweden, UK, France, Denmark, and Hungary, who have at the time announced a net zero binding targets by 2050. We did not take into account the international offsets in the modeling. In terms of the carbon pricing, we took the values that have been used by European Commission in its net zero scenario modeling. We further constrained the emissions from buildings and road transport in line with the European Commission long-term projections. And so as we said before, the net zero scenario that we model is very much in line with the European Commission's net zero scenario called 1.5 technology, which basically focuses on technological evolution and improvements that might be required in order to meet net zero. European Commission has modeled another net zero scenario, which they call 1.5 life, which essentially focus on the potential need for changes in lifestyles in order to reach net zero. But we focus on the technology of the net zero scenario of the European Commission. So as I said, we use the energy system optimization model, which is a simple linear optimization model that takes into account key EU member state countries individually, such as Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, France, UK, Ireland, Poland. The other European countries are represented as a group of countries, such as, grouping into regions such as East, Central, South European regions. So we model all the key existing energy supply technologies. We also model new technologies like hydrogen, green hydrogen production, or blue hydrogen production from natural gas with CCS, for example. On the demand side, we include the energy services demand in the buildings, in the road transport, in the industry. It is a large-scale simulation model, and it covers hourly system operation, as well as investment in infrastructure for the key technologies that we model. So turning into to the results, this table shows you the projection coming out of two scenarios that we model. So the net zero scenario by 2050 and the 90% GHG reduction scenario that we also model. And it also shows the comparison to the 2018 actual results. And it shows the final consumption structure. And you can see that there are key technologies for the net zero that would be needed. So obviously the renewable electricity, such as wind and solar. The net zero also relies on biomethane, hydrogen and synthetic fuels, and CCS. The difference between the 90% GHG reduction scenario and the net zero is, you can see that the key technologies like hydrogen and synthetic liquid fuels have an impact. So the 10%, further 10% reduction in GHG reduction would have a key implication on the usage of hydrogen and liquid fossil fuel. Further, in terms of the CO2 emissions balance, we'd like to stress the importance of CCS here. You can see that in the 90% scenario reduction, the permanent CO2 storage needs to be increased by a factor of 4 between 90% scenario and net zero. So in a 90% scenario, the model shows roughly 100 million ton of CO2 is needed to be stored, and then that is compared to almost more than 400 million ton in a net zero scenario. And in particular, the negative emission needs to be increased from 20 million ton of CO2 storage to 250. That is one of the main difference between the net zero and the 90% GHG reduction scenario in our modeling exercise. Now let me focus on the net zero and what it means in terms of generation mix. And it, in a net zero, the generation mix at the EU level is a truly zero carbon electricity system that is needed to support the net zero target by 2050. We can see that renewables, and in particular wind onshore, offshore, and solar accounts for more than 80% of the generation mix. The rest is split between nuclear and biomass with CCS. You can see also there is a 60% of terawatt hours of generation coming from CCGT. And when CCGT runs to produce those 60 terawatt hours of electricity, they mostly consume renewable gas, such as biomethane and synthetic gas. That is a tremendous and difference between the net zero and the generation mix that we observe back in 2018, as you can see. Coming to the building sector, the modeling shows that the key technologies that will be used for space heating and water heating is a combination of hybrid heat pumps and air source heat pumps. So both of those two key technologies consumes electricity, and for hybrid heat pumps, it consumes both combination of electricity during off-peak time, but in the peak time, it consumes synthetic gas and biomethane. And the combination of these gives you a reduction in the energy consumption that is needed for space heating. Electricity as a fuel to produce the heat accounts for 65% of the thermal energy surface demand, with the rest being the renewable gases. And that is one of the key sort of like technologies that the model sees in the building sector, and in particular for the space and water heating. Coming to the road transport, you can see that 80% of the car stock, the road car stock, is electric vehicles. Public road transport is also mostly electrified, with 84% of vehicles stocks are electric vehicles. In the heavy goods vehicles, we see a mixed picture of hydrogen fuel and renewable gas fueled trucks, with only limited electrification of the heavy goods vehicles. So in order to support this massive electrification of final consumption, we will need to expand electricity supply. And that, this chart shows you the historic electricity generation in Europe, but also the projection from the modeling. You can see that it needs a tremendous expansion, at least by a factor of 5, the average growth rate between 1919 and 2019. For the next 30 years, we would need this expansion growth rate in order to meet the electrification targets that is envisaged in the modeling exercise that we've done. In terms of the wind and solar, we can see again projection from the modeling plotted against the historical wind generation. We also plotted the recent European Commission's Fit for 55 wind target of 480 gigawatt of wind. We can still see that even the most recent 2030 targets that the European Commission put forth is slightly short from the level that is required by 2030 in order to get to the 2050 net zero target. Similarly, here on this chart, you can see the projection of the solar generation based on the modeling, but also the historic trend. Here you can see that more or less we are, if we take the historical trend, then we are slightly short of the target by 2050. But the European Commission's target that has been put forth in the recent Fit for 55 is actually quite aggressive in relation to the net zero target pathway that we plotted based on the modeling. But I think on balance, both wind and solar, the Fit for 55 targets in 2030 are more or less on balance, are in line. If we combine the two targets together by 2030, they should be more or less in line with the trajectory that that came out of the modeling for wind and solar. The other key energy vector is renewable gas or bioenergy. Here we also plotted the 3 past years of biomethane production, historic production, and we also plotted the projected trend from the modeling. We also plotted a couple of the targets for based on the Fit for 55 target that the European Commission has published, and also the very recent REPowerEU target that aims to reduce our reliance on Russian gas by 2/3 this year. So what it basically shows you is the policy target for the bioenergy, and in particular biomethane, based on the Fit for 55 is short of the level that is envisaged by our modeling. That is shown on the orange bar. But the most updated one, the REPowerEU, is actually quite in line. So what it tells us is that in order to reduce our reliance on Russian gas, we would need to double our efforts to in terms of rolling out biomethane production. And that doubling of the efforts relative to the Fit for 55 is actually in line with our linear projection for the biomethane production that is needed to hit 2050 net zero target that we remodeled. Now, in terms of the question about the system flexibility that is needed for net zero, so we conceptualize this, the source of flexibility into 3 types. So the first is the spatial flexibility, or the role of electricity and gas networks to connect various locations. We can see that, for example, the role of cross-border trade in electricity needs to be increased by a factor of 3 relative to 2018 in order to support this the electrification rate that we see in the modeling. Now, in terms of the seasonal flexibility, or the role of the energy storage, and in particular the inter-seasonal storage, the summer versus the winter storage, our modeling relies on the methane interseasonal storage, the traditional long-range natural gas storage, because in our modeling we envisage an uptake of biomethane, which we have just discussed, and that although the path that we charted in terms of the rollout of biomethane is quite aggressive relative to both the old target, but also the new policy target, the usage of the biomethane, and in particular the usage of biomethane in the building sector, will necessitate the need for interseasonal gas storage, but that the capacity of the interseasonal gas storage in Europe will be reduced by a factor of 4 relative to the capacity that is on the system at the moment. So the key conclusion here in terms of the interseasonal storage is that because of the biomethane usage in our modeling, and in particular to heat the homes via hybrid heat pumps, we will still need interseasonal gas storage to move demand between summer and the winter. Now, in terms of the intraday flexibility, we see a diverse set of technologies to meet the requirements of intraday flexibility, ranging from battery electric storage to the V2G. On the hydrogen, there is also a need to have an hourly flexibility to modulate the hydrogen demand. Also, the hybrid heat pumps plays a key role in ramping requirements for the space heating, for the intraday space heating. Finally, we'd like to draw your attention to the role of the sector coupling technology. The key sector coupling technology in our modeling is actually green hydrogen production via water electrolysis. And what this chart shows you is the monthly production of green and blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is the hydrogen production from steam methane reformation using natural gas and CCS. So what it shows you is blue hydrogen is quite stable. It's a baseload technology to produce blue hydrogen. Whereas the green hydrogen on the monthly basis, you can see that it's ramping up during the summer and has a lower production profile during the winter months. And that's not a coincidence, because if you can also see the role of solar generation is that actual solar ramps up during the summer. So what it tells us here is that there is a tight coupling between the green hydrogen production at the monthly level and the solar generation production. So green hydrogen is mostly used to modulate the excess of energy that might be produced from solar. But also green hydrogen is therefore to move the excess of solar generation during summer months when the energy demand is low to winter months when energy demand is higher. This same chart shows you the same story that I've just discussed, but at the hourly granularity. So basically, you can see this at the hourly granularity, we have a very high correlation between the green hydrogen production and solar energy production at the hourly granularity. You can see the coincidence of the peaks and troughs between hydrogen production using electrolyzers, which is in the yellow curves, versus the solar, which is on the gray. But basically, the correlation is very high, therefore reinforcing the hypothesis, at least in our modeling, that the coupling between the gas and electricity happens in particular between the green hydrogen and solar energy production. So this final chart shows you the comparison between our central net zero scenario that we have been discussing so far, and compare this with our two other extreme net zero scenario: net zero electricity, NZE, and net zero gas, which is NZG. So the difference between the electricity net zero and the gas net zero is the variation in terms of availability of bioenergy in the net zero gas and availability of wind and solar in the net zero electricity, as well as cost reduction. So we've done the sensitivity by doubling or reducing both the availability of these key energy technologies, but also the capex and opex of those technologies. So basically, you can see that obviously varying the degree of availability of bioenergy in wind produces and not counterintuitive results, i.e. in the net zero electricity by having lower costs of wind and solar, but also high availability of wind and solar, you would have much more electrification in the final energy demand, but also heavily relying on those key technologies. On the contrary, of course, is that if you increase the availability of bioenergy and reducing its cost, then the role of bioenergy in the net zero increases dramatically. Which the key conclusion here is all the three set of net zero scenarios is possible. The role of the key technologies that will get us to the net zero is heavily dependent on the technological evolution and all the cost reduction of those key technologies. Which leads us to some of the key conclusions from the modeling. Now, obviously, net zero is a binding set, binding constraints that we have implemented in our modeling. And the key message here is that failing any of these key technologies like wind, solar, or bioenergy with CCS will mean that the other technologies, the low carbon energy producing technology, needs to scale up because net zero is a binding constraint. So if we fail to roll out the bioenergy production, then the net zero pathway will be heavily relying on wind and solar, and perhaps on energy efficiency policies that we have not modeled explicitly. Likewise, if wind and solar rollout is scaled back from the trajectory that is envisaged in our modeling, then other key set of technologies that would enable us to reach net zero will need to ramp up dramatically. So that is and obviously in terms of the flexibility requirements, we need all key set of technologies. As we mentioned before, we model interseasonal flexibility in the form of natural gas storage. We model the green hydrogen coupling with the electricity production, and in particular electricity production from wind and solar. So I'd like to hand over from now on to my colleague Michael Pollitt to discuss some of the policy recommendation coming from the modeling. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Chyong. That was great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to just say a little bit about some of the policy recommendations coming out of our modelling. I refer you to the detailed report if you want to find out all of the 41 specific policy recommendations that we drew from the modelling. As you can see, we've grouped them into a number of areas to do with the market and its organisation, and also to do with fixed costs, hydrogen, financing, the role of the EU versus specific countries, and longer term versus short term steps. Next slide, please, Chyong. So background to the policy recommendations, some of which Chyong has already trailed. The future under net zero only partially depends on relative fossil fuel prices. We flex the fossil fuel prices as part of the the model sensitivity, and you still need all of the technologies that were mentioned, because the point is that it's the net zero constraints and the need to meet your time varying constraints of having a zero carbon energy system. And it's those constraints which force you to use particular technologies to meet them. And as Chyong said, we need to scale up multiple key technologies within the time frame to hit net zero. If you start eliminating whole classes of technology, you put much more strain on already strained technology rollouts. So I think one of the key things that came out of this modeling for me is that CCS is absolutely essential to delivering net zero, both CCS with negative emissions from bioenergy, and also CCS to create the CO2 that you might need for synthetic fuels. And you also need, even with CCS, some direct air capture of CO2 if you're really going to hit net zero across the whole energy system. And of course, one of the most controversial things in our whole modeling process, when we were discussing this with the stakeholders who we were working with on the modeling via SARE, was, well, can you really believe some of the CCS scale-up scenarios that you have? Can you really believe that there's enough biomass available to create your negative emissions? And absolutely, those are key requirements for net zero, and any political constraints on achieving them threatens net zero fundamentally. But we do have a few recommendations which we could implement in the next few years. Next slide, please. The other thing that I think comes out of this is that although particular technologies are important, there's still quite a wide range of estimates, as Chyong put up. The difference between a world which favors electricity and a world which favors gas leads to very big differences in the scale of the rollout of particular technology. Even though technology might remain important, that the scale of it does vary. And we don't really know how some of these key technology costs are going to evolve over the next few years. So we've still got a net zero which involves a wide range of final potential outcomes. What is absolutely obvious from a modeling exercise like this is that you massively need to scale up technologies which are currently very small. So hydrogen, CCS, and biomethane, which are still, in their infancy in terms of meeting net zero on the energy system, are need to be scaled up enormously to meet net zero. In the modeling that we did, I think it became clear that a model which allows you to use both methane, biomethane or synthetic methane, and hydrogen probably suggests that you'd have separate methane and hydrogen networks. You really only need the hydrogen for heavy duty transport and heavy duty industry, and you can use the existing methane network to continue to supply methane. Next slide, please. So some of the things that come out of a sector coupling exercise, well, the clue is in the coupling. Now it becomes very important that you don't distort the price signals between an electricity sector, which, as Chyong pointed out, is crucially using, say, solar energy to produce hydrogen, and that hydrogen is going off to the gas side of the energy system, either to be used directly or to produce synthetic methane. Then it becomes really important to harmonize taxes across energy vectors and harmonize charging for, say, transportation in both gas and electricity networks. You absolutely have to harmonize carbon taxation. At the moment, we don't tax direct combustion of methane through the emissions trading scheme. We only tax use of gas to produce electricity. That is clearly a massive distortion, which limits sector coupling between the current gas and electricity systems, and that must be eliminated. Energy efficiency remains a critical policy. What Chyong, I think, didn't mention was what we modeled is simply the existing 2018 energy demand and meeting that with a net zero system. Even within that, you need massive energy efficiency of about, a third reduction in total energy. Then imagine the economy, we hope, grows to 2050. You need further energy efficiency measures in order to keep energy consumption down and to reduce the physical challenge of meeting net zero by scaling up currently nascent technologies. We still don't fully have a single market in methane across the whole of Europe. There's still significant price variation and lack of two-way interconnection in methane. That's improving, but we would need a single market in methane, just as we have a single market in electricity across Europe. Both the electricity and gas networks would need to reflect the value of flexibility correctly. I mean, what we're doing is a massive sector coupling exercise which meets net zero. One of the things that you would then need to investigate quite carefully out of that is who ends up paying for what, because we've minimized total system cost, but it's quite possible that somebody who's consuming gas in this system is paying a very high unit price for energy, even though that gas is providing flexibility, which the electricity system can't provide. So pricing across gas and electricity networks is really important in net zero and requires a lot of regulatory thinking about how to deliver that. Chyong was bullish about continuing the growth of wind and solar in Europe. But as we showed, that's completely essential to delivering net zero. Under any scenario for net zero, any range of prices, you need to massively increase both wind and solar relative to today. So continuing very high rates of growth out to 2050 in both wind and solar is essential. And the development of offshore wind in particular is critical to meeting net zero in Europe. Next slide, please. Electricity is really important. So one of the controversial things in our modeling was, well, what is the role of gas? And of course, certain electricity players in the current energy system continue to argue that you can have a fully electrified energy system. We show that actually that would not be the least cost way of delivering net zero. And we're not even sure that it's technically possible to deliver net zero with a fully electrified energy system. What the modeling shows is there is a continuing role for gaseous fuel, even if it's produced from electricity. You still need some role for something that looks like gas, which has a much higher energy density and has also got the ease of storage, which gas has relative to electricity. So even though electricity is critical to net zero, and even though there will be substantial electrification of transport, you can't fully eliminate the use of other fuels in mobile transport, either synthetically produced or produced directly with hydrogen. What the modeling also shows is trade in electricity would substantially increase across Europe, and there would be deep flexibility required within electricity networks to support all the distributed solar and distributed energy which is required to meet net zero. And so the challenge of getting an electricity system which delivers net zero remains extremely high, even though the current rollout of wind and solar and the current trends in decarbonising the electricity system are promising for meeting a 2050 target. Next slide, please. Another thing that is critical is because gas continues to be important, and because green gas or decarbonised gas is essential to meeting the constraints which net zero impose on the energy system. Of course, defining what we mean by different types of gases is important. And so what do we mean by green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, grey hydrogen, purple hydrogen, which I think is produced from nuclear? As I'm sure you would immediately recognize, different colors mean different things in different countries. And of course, what they mean is not just a matter of color, it's a matter of actual real content as well. You know, so hydrogen could be deemed to be green, as you can see here, if it's, you know, if a very high percentage of it is produced from renewables, but not all of it. But so that might vary from country to country. It clearly does require standardization across Europe. And in order to prevent gaming in the definitions of different blends of hydrogen. And similar to this, we need to work out how to define hydrogen storage in the same way that we've struggled to define electricity storage as being, you know, is it inputting to the system, or is it exiting from the system, or how do we handle the fact that it's doing both? It can be neither classified as generation or demand. It clearly exists as both at different times of the day. So definitions will continue to be important. Next slide, please. And this is, you know, just a few final suggestions. We think there still is some role for large-scale innovation projects. You know, we're still at very early stages of some of these key net zero technologies, and in particular, we're at an early stage from a commercial scale test of some of them. You know, so there are 1 or 2 whole cities that are being converted to hydrogen on their gas network. We need more large-scale experiments like that. And initially, you know, part to hydrogen technologies, which are key to net zero according to our modeling. You know, there's still a lot we don't know about how to create a genuinely coupled net zero energy system. National gas transmission systems and local distribution systems for gas, you know, they're still at very early stages of projects which are about part to gas or part to hydrogen. And these projects need to be significantly scaled up. You know, there's a lot of projects looking at improving flexibility in the electricity system. Very few projects, relatively speaking, looking at improving flexibility across electricity and gas systems together. And in line with that, we need to line up, you know, 10-year planning for gas networks with 10-year planning for electricity networks. Now, of course, the 10-year plan may be to massively reduce the gas network in a particular area and switch much of the demand over to electricity, but the plan should be coordinated across both networks. And we've talked about the need to harmonize both energy taxation and the scope of the emissions trading scheme, both inside the EU and across the rest of Europe, in order to promote genuine economic coupling between gas and electricity systems. And, you know, maybe we can harness the role of large energy consuming companies who say they're interested in net zero because they can actually finance some genuine net zero consistent investments across gas and electricity. And maybe it's also true that, as we've discovered with the pandemic, and as unfortunately we may be discovering with the Ukraine crisis, there is a lot of money available when your backup is against the wall, and willingness to spend large sums on the part of governments to recover from COVID or to recover from the post-war period, and that could be directed to investments which promote sector coupling and the scale up of these key technologies to deliver net zero. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to any questions. Please put them in the chat. Chyong, do you want to say anything about some of the questions that have been asked already?
Yeah, so there was a question about the storage, whether we take into account the storage in our analysis, and yes, I think based on the results that we see, I think there is a range of storage technologies that we need for the scenarios that we model, from 90% GHG reduction to net zero. So, and I think we've discussed the role of conventional, so like gas storage, to modulate winter and summer season demand, to the intraday storage like batteries, and also the role of vehicle to grid to supplement the electricity demand and production variation within the day, and obviously we model the intraday sort of hydrogen storage. And I also in particular noted the importance of the green hydrogen production via water electrolysis is to actually modulate some of the fluctuation and excess of energy production coming from wind and solar in particular. So that was one of the questions. The other question is about actually the cost, which is a central question for any sort of like economic modeling, is what's the cost of all of this to get to net zero. And the answer from myself was that we have all the data that we need to calculate. So we do have the total system costs, and as you mentioned, Michael, the allocation of those costs to the end users, and in particular the treatment of CapEx and OpEx, is not a trivial exercise, and in particular because of the coupling of the sectors that we model. So, for example, how would you allocate the gas transmission to the electricity consumers, or what is the role of the water electrolysis to produce green hydrogen to the domestic gas consumers for the heating purposes, for example. So those are the questions that we look forward to work in the upcoming paper, and that's what we mentioned in the answer, is that we do have all of these numbers that we need just to figure out the ways to allocate and to discuss the implication of this. So basically, yes, we do have those numbers. We need to calculate. We can come up with the wholesale cost at the wholesale level, but also potentially retail. What we have not included in our modeling is the taxation, which has not been included in the model. So it's at the moment it's techno-economic system optimization model that takes into account the CapEx and OpEx, all the technologies that we model, but we did not include the taxation. And we also include, obviously, the cost of the end-use technologies, as that we mentioned, like hybrid heat pumps, air source heat pumps. We also model the conventional gas boilers and electric heaters. But obviously, with all the constraints on the emission and cost, we see the results that we presented in terms of that. So those are the two questions. So yeah, we're happy to to answer any follow-up questions that you might have. So the papers that we publish, both the extensive reports, you can access this online with all the details, like modeling results published there. But the key policy and summary of the conclusions is also in the paper that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So that's probably everything from me for now, Michael.
Thanks, Chyong. Any other questions?
Not that I can see from the questions and answer. No.
It's probably worth, it's worth reflecting, isn't it, on I think one of the key things that is still very difficult is the cost allocation, isn't it? Because what we've done is we've done an optimization for the whole system, but it's quite clear that there are going to be pockets of very high cost in the system, aren't there? There's going to be some marginal energy which is really expensive, and it's not clear that who would be expected to pick up on that, or there'll be some pockets of energy which are really cheap. And the question is whether we allow people to just have those. And, if you're lucky to be sitting in some cheap energy and be in the right place, you could get out of your contribution to paying for the whole system costs. And, that's going to be very interesting, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And as I mentioned before, how would you treat the and how would you price the carbon capture that is, the carbon that is needed to produce electric fuels, for example. So if we need to decarbonize the heavy duty vehicles and that mostly rely at the moment on diesel, for example, and if we indeed then need synthetic diesel, then the chemical engineering suggests that a part of that is needed. The carbon content is needed to combine the electric fuel to produce electric fuel. So how would then we go about figuring out what's the price of the carbon that is captured and then utilized in producing the synthetic fuels? Those are I think very important and interesting question. I think at the moment the modeling has been focused exactly on what we present, that is on certainly the pathways that gets us to the role of technologies and innovation, and the path to rollout of those technologies that we show. But the important question is obviously on the economics of pricing, and relate this to the current setup of the market design, whether this is in US or Europe. Those are the questions, the gap probably in the literature that I think we should be encouraged to explore more in details in the coming years or months even, because that's the very important questions that has not been explored or limited science.
And I'm going to ask you a cheeky question, because we did this model in 2018, and I know I've already asked you this question, but I'm going to ask you again. Gas prices were quite low then, and we were saying, well, the do net zero unit cost of energy is going to go up in Europe substantially. Any reflections on whether it's already gone up to anywhere near the net zero level?
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting question. We should have prepared a couple of slides to compare. Now, unfortunately, I haven't done so, but it's something that we should look into. What is also interesting in the context of the net zero and the role of fossil fuel is the potential for exercise of market power. Because if the end game for large producers of gas and oil is that there is no fossil fuel in Europe in 30 years to come, then what is the value of cooperation in terms of keeping prices relatively low to support your long-term investment. Because at the moment, what I can think of, let's say that if Russia thinks that Europe is serious about decarbonizing and diversifying away from fossil fuel and in particular gas, so why then not exercise market power now to rip off Europe, for example, and jack up the prices to the level that will just expedite this move away from Russian gas? So there is a credible commitment problem as signaling that, beyond 2050 net zero target, what is the role of fossil fuel? And the fossil fuel in the energy mix is largely zero from the net zero system point of view. There may be, as we showed in our net zero gas sort of scenario, is that there might be a large role for blue hydrogen, for example, that is coming from natural gas steam reformation, provided the gas is very, very cheap, and provided that the system and technologies to produce blue hydrogen is also cheap, and there is abundance of bioenergy to offset the residual CO2 emission, because we need to realize that, for example, blue hydrogen production still emits, although it emits 5 to 10%. So there's a limit on carbon capture rate, as we understand, in order to produce blue hydrogen. So 5 or 10% from the process of blue hydrogen production is still emitted. But if we put a net zero constraints, then that 5 to 10% needs to be offset somewhere else in the system. So the key role of fossil fuel, at least in the primary energy to produce blue hydrogen, for example, heavily relies on the availability of negative emission to offset. Or either there is a technological breakthrough that will enable 99% of the capture rate from the blue hydrogen, and the producers of natural gas outside of Europe commits not to jack up prices or exercise market power, so that the gas prices is very low to encourage the uptake of blue hydrogen. So that is the dimension that I think is very important, and that has a lot of very interesting, I would say, game theoretic, but also more so like economic questions around pricing and so on the energy.
Very good. I think I did suggest in some paper that we could sign wind speed related gas contracts in future. But watching our presentation, maybe we should sign sun related gas contracts in future. Yeah. Because it will depend how much intermittent energy we've got available as to how much gas we might need in order to meet our energy requirements in a particular year. And yeah, maybe we should sign contracts which are weather related, not oil price related.
Exactly.
Great. Well, I'm looking to Rebecca that our time is up, and I want to thank everybody who has tuned in. And if you've got any other questions, please do just feel free to get in touch with us individually.
Thank you so much. We'd like to thank Chyong and Michael Pollitt for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.